wait a second, let me start recording, because that, that seems polite. Um, if the session, wait 1 second, that was the problem. My slides were too large. It's going to try again. I should be able to. So here's the thing. Open up, download that file, Paper Topics, that's now on Blackboard. That wasn't before, but now it is. And as always, I apologize. If there's a topic that's not on that list and you'd like to do it, shoot me an email and I'll say yes, and I'll probably also chip in with the names of some authors that can help you, search for resources. And so that's what I'd say. So yeah, paper, I'm just going to write that down, but that should be clear. I'm writing it down because my slides still aren't good.
Did you take a video?
Yeah, should be.
Oh, okay. Is everything done?
I think so. I'm teaching a class. So everything's good. You gotta come over and say hi to the students. Hi, welcome. Okay, so yeah, paper topics can totally be self-generated. Check with me first. Still converting these slides. It's kind of peaceful, sort of like fishing. And so tonight's lecture is going to be a mix of, yeah, I think I'm going to do a quiz after the break. So it's there, it's ready, but I think I'm going to do it after the break. And in fact, I'm going to remind myself, I'll do it now. No, let's do, so I'm going to do it after the break, but the one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set, you won't forget, oh my gosh, it's not even that hard. I mean, I shouldn't say that because who knows, things can be hard. I'm going to set an alarm so that I don't go too long, because the first part of the lecture, like the human behavioral ecology, is quite a bit longer than human behavioral ecology is quite a bit longer than the evolutionary psych. Okay. I will be tired then? No, this stuff is like, it's so energizing. But the students might be tired. I could totally see that. Okay. Cool. As long as everyone's in the same boat, should be okay. Now, the only thing that's you don't have is a little drawing pad. Great. So originally this was going to be, there are going to be 2 chapters from Lalonde and Brown, but I shortened it to just 1 chapter. Yeah, everyone has to regulate their metabolism in their own way. Sugar is risky because you can go up and then down. Caffeine might be helpful for some of us, but you have to be able to get sleep after lecture. There you go. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about tonight is we're kind of doing the last couple like approaches to trying to explain human behavior evolutionarily. That's not quite yet cultural evolution. So we're going to talk about human behavioral ecology first, which is trying to think of the adaptive functions of human behavior and ask, well, can we actually measure the costs and benefits, and does it appear that humans are acting in ways that maximize fitness or balances trade-offs? And And so I'm going to talk about a bunch of animal examples, some very successful examples of explaining and understanding behavior in animals, and then how that kind of thinking has been applied to humans, and with some success, less success sometimes. Um, we're going to talk about examples of polyandry and polygyny in animals, and in a little bit in humans. And we're going to talk about the demographic transition, because when Dawkins talks about human behavior, he's very much in the evolutionary psychology um, sort of approach that all the examples of human behavior that don't seem to maximize reproductive fitness reflect sort of recent mistakes, behaviors that used to be adaptive in a different environment, and that's really what evolutionary psychology is arguing. Um, and so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So when you study behavioral ecology, which really was kind of a lot of my graduate training, I was in an animal behavior program um, at UC Davis. You spend a lot of time thinking about costs and benefits and measuring like the fitness consequences of behaviors and seeing if you can understand why animals are making the choices that they do. And one of the sort of big um, um, one thing that's weird, you're seeing the slides, you're not seeing me, I don't think, which is fine. Um, oh, you can. Okay, I see a little black rectangle in the lower left. As long as you can see the slide, that's all that really matters, but that's okay too. Okay, um, so optimality models are a way of basically asking if we understand why animals or people are doing what they're doing by predicting behavior based on our understanding of the costs and benefits make that define how profitable different decisions are, and then testing those models in the field by asking if animals or people change their behavior in ways that are predicted by these models. So the general form optimality models, you identify what's the trait that's likely to affect fitness. The truth is 90% of these optimality models in the beginning were applied to feeding behavior, energy intake, partly because that's one of the easiest traits to quantify, and it's actually much easier to measure feeding behavior and energy intake on a short time scale than reproductive success. In other words, a lot of optimality models are trying to figure out why animals eat the foods that they do, because of the reasonable assumption, but it's still an assumption, that like maximizing calorie intake is probably related to reproductive success in the long term. Um, so what the model does is it'll include both, benefits and costs of different decisions, different behaviors, and then you identify within the model what's the optimal strategy, and that's the behavior where B minus C, and B minus C is benefit minus cost, is maximized. And then you go see if animals behave consistently with those models. So benefits minus costs. Okay, so the like technical terms for the parts of an optimality model include the strategy set. So that's the range of choices that an animal has. And so those choices could be for feeding, it could be, large seeds, small seeds. It could be leave the patch you're in or stay in the patch that you're in. Um, it could be emigrate from a group and try to breed on your own versus stay in the group and try to inherit a breeding position versus stay in the group and help your close relatives rear offspring, right? So all of those are, as the strategy set, is the range of choices. The currency is what is being maximized. In an ideal world, that currency should be lifetime reproductive success, but not even lifetime reproductive success. It should be something like, um, ideally, it should be fitness, right? And that might be lifetime reproductive success. But lifetime reproductive success has trade-offs too. Like maybe you have lots of babies, but they're sickly. And if you'd had fewer, they'd be in better condition and they'd each have more offspring. So it could be something like number of grandchildren. That would be great on average. But that's in the ideal world. Actually, usually it's just something like energy intake. Something easy to measure. Energy per time. Okay. And then the constraints are the different parameters and how they vary. Um, so parameters for like um, there might be a maximum and minimum food size. There are different the rates of foraging success in different patches, but it's also the constraints can also include things in more sophisticated models that we're not going to get to tonight. They can include things like the cognitive capacity of the forager, like how can they recognize whether they're in a good patch or not a good patch? How do their strategies change when they actually don't know, when they have to like sample or learn to figure out what the patch is like? Anyway, we're just going to do the simplest case. So the simplest case, this is from the 70s, is the prey choice model. Um, and imagine, you are like an oyster catcher or a gull, and you have a choice between two prey items. And the the prey items that are available in the rocky intertidal or in the beach are either large clams or small clams. Um, and so the question is, your strategy set is whether you should specialize on only large clams. Um, I guess you could also specialize on only small clams, or you should be a generalist and eat any clam that you stumble across. So this would be and this would be a specialist. And since we're going to say in a second that large clams have more nutrients than small clams, um, I'll just say eating only small clams is another kind of specialist strategy, but I'm just gonna like I'm just gonna eliminate that one to start. That's just dumb, but it's also a specialist strategy. Um, so any strategy where you avoid eating large clams is going to reduce your energy intake. But it's an interesting question whether you should eat any clam that's encountered or specialize on only the best clams. And so we're going to get to some of the trade-offs involved with each strategy in a second. So any optimality model needs a currency. I already talked about fitness being the ideal currency of any model. However, um, you often, that's a lot harder to measure, right? You need a lot longer time scale to relate short-term decisions to lifetime reproductive success or fitness. And so people usually use surrogates for fitness, traits that you think probably and likely do, but not always have been demonstrated to correlate with fitness, like good nutrition, or in this case, energy. So energy rate gain, calories per minute, that's what these models are going to maximize. And so one of the things that, you know, is important to see here is that like rate of energy gain is only one part of fitness. And so a lot of animals, it turns out, are balancing energy gain with things like safety, right, and survival. And so the model that we're going to develop here doesn't take that into account at all, but a lot of really good behavioral ecology has looked at that trade-off between survival and rate of energy gain and made much better predictions that get met in the wild all the time, better than models that just look at rate of energy gain. So that's just a long way of saying, you start simple and then you build up. So in this example, large clams have 100 calories of energy, small clams 50 calories, um, which is great. So of course, you should just eat large clams, or maybe you should eat anything, because if you find a large clam and a small clam, you eat them both, that's 150 calories. If you only ate the large clam, that's 100 calories. But wait, there's a constraint, which is the handling time, right? So it takes time to break open the shell and eat what's inside. And there's also search time. And so you can vary handling time and search time. Um, and the what's really important is the search time. In this case, we could ask, is what's important? Is it the search time for a small clam or a search time for a large clam? I'm going to take a poll. Do we care about the search time? Sure, what the heck? Let's take a look. Let's do a poll. Here we go. Sharing menu, navigate slides, share files. Nope. Okay, we're going to do a little poll. Multiple choice. And the question is, only for large clams, only for small clams, search time for both large and small clams. Okay, so let's start. This is not an easy question, and I just want to see, like, probably you're only going to be getting this right for sure if you've heard about optimal foraging before. I think when I was your age, I would not have gotten this question right unless it was the second time I was hearing about this. Cool. So I'm gonna stop the poll in about 5 seconds, just because this isn't like a test. I just wanted us to think about it. Okay, so I'm going to show the responses. Okay, so can guys see? Okay, cool. So majority said searching for both, but 9 said for large and 2 said only for small. So here's the thing. I was trying to like foreshadow the answer a little bit, when I pointed out that like large clams have the most calories, and if you ever have a large clam, you should just eat it. The question is not should, and the question really is, if you have a small clam right there, should you eat it or should you ignore it and specialize on the large clams? And that question actually only depends on how long is it going to take for you to find a large clam, right? So it's this is a sort of tricky question and it's a little hard. The correct answer is number one, only for large clams, and I'm going to sort of derive that, and hopefully in about 5 slides that'll make sense for everyone. Cool. And trust me, this is not an easy question because lots of people got lots of great papers and somewhat famous in my line of work for working this out the first time. So the answer was never like intuitive. Okay, so here we have a really simple version of this model. The handling time for each of these clams is about the same. There are some birds, Egyptian vultures and seagulls, that drop. Egyptian vultures are known to drop rocks onto eggs to try to break them. Um, Gulls drop, and oyster catchers, I think, drop shellfish to break them, and crows drop walnuts to break them open. Um, so in this case, the idea is that the handling time is the same. There are lots of versions of this model where they're not. Large clams might actually be harder to break open, but we're doing the simple one. So that means if you have a large clam in your mouth, it's going to take you a minute to break it open, and the profitability is going to be 100 calories per 1 minute. So the calories per time. I'm so sorry. Small clams, profitability, really easy, 50 calories per the same 1 minute of handling type. So here's the question: what if the two prey types vary in how common they are, their frequency? If they vary in frequency or density, that's going to affect the search time. In other words, if it's, read my mind, if large clams are very common, they'll have a short search time. If they're very rare, density is very low, they will have a long search time. And the search time determines the optimal strategy. And so this is the the equation, the simplest optimal foraging model. We're looking at the way to think about this equation is, the thing that's really interesting about this equation, first of all, is that it only includes the only search time for large clam is included in this model. And so the question is, if you have a small clam in your mouth, and so that means that's the left side of this equation. No search time because you've already found a small clam. Should you eat that small clam, and in which case you'll get 50 calories per 1 minute? Or should you ignore that, save your minute, spend that minute searching for a large clam, and then eating that large clam and handling it, eating that large clam and getting the energy? So we can look at this graph, and we probably can figure out what the solution is. I made a little Excel formula for it, but we could actually, like, looking at this, we know that this is 50 calories, and the question is this 100 over search time plus 1. So if this search time is less than a minute, then if the search time is less than a minute, then the specialist on large clams is the better strategy. However, if the search time is more than a minute, then the right side will be smaller than the left side, and you should be a generalist. So the critical question is search time for a large greater than or less than 1? So I made a little graph. That's what's in the next slide. So why don't we look at that? And I'm kind of going to say the same thing. And let's see if it makes sense after the next slide. So what we have here is a graph that has in the black line, 50 per minute. That's the energy gain from a small clam. And that's always 50, right? Clams in your mouth, you're not searching for it. On the x-axis, we have the search time for a large clam. And that is, and so what we're asking is, what does that do to the rate of energy gain of leaving a small clam and going off looking for, finding, and handling a large clam? So if the search time for a large clam is less than a minute, is less than a minute, you should, then the fitness of being a specialist is greater than that of a generalist that's eating that small clam, and you should specialize. However, if the search time for a large clam is greater than 1, now the fitness of being a generalist, eating that small clam, and then going to look for another clam, large or small, is higher, and you should be a generalist. Cool. And so this is the graph of the solution of the equations from the previous slide for a whole bunch of different values of search time, SL. Less than 1. This is, I'll just remind us that this is SL. Okay, the really cool thing about this model is not that it is that exciting a mathematical model, but that it's testable. And so this guy named John Krebs and students tested this model with a large relative of our chickadee that's called a great tit, Paris major, in England in the 70s. And so what they did was they set up this little conveyor belt that they could rig up to provide a worm at regular intervals. And the cool thing was that they could vary it's kind of like search time, except in this case the birds know where they're coming, but they read my mind. They have to learn what the reward rate is. And so what they could do is they could vary the time interval for a feeder with large worms and a feeder with that had both large and small. And so the worms actually they have to take them and like smash them if they're like mealworms to kill them before eating. So they have a handling time, but then they also have how long do you have to wait before you might get a chance to get a large worm. And so they rig the machines to provide large and small worms at a range of intervals. And basically what they found was that, so they set it up so that there was a cutoff where the large worms were provided frequently enough that you'd miss out on large worms if you were spending time eating the small worms. And the model predicts that you should ignore small worms and just wait for a large one, right? And then they had the birds in the aviaries and tested them with these little food conveyor belts. And what they found, they got a publication that's like a classic with like, they just looked at like 10 birds. But most of the birds were at least qualitatively consistent with the model, right? So this is one bird over several trials when the large worms were presented, less frequently. The birds ate both indiscriminately, and it took not the like mathematical optimum, but a little bit later, um, the birds switched to not being exactly specialists, not completely ignoring small worms, but mostly ignoring small worms and um, waiting just for large worms. So it's kind of it's a really interesting experiment. It shows that birds do adjust their behavior based on sort of the reward rates, um, although it doesn't exactly match the model. So take homes from prey choice, and all of these were like really sort of new and interesting insights when they first came out. Whether or not to specialize depends on the relative profitabilities of the prey types, energy over handling time, and the density, the search time, for just the more profitable prey. So it doesn't matter how common the less profitable one, what matters is how common is the more profitable one. And the experimental results sometimes match the model predictions closely, um, but they don't always, and they usually don't exactly match predictions. And this is interesting. And when the models aren't met, that's what sort of guides you to figure out what you have to look at next. And the topics that people have looked at as follow-ups, one are sort of cognitive limitations, information, um, the need to sample and learn and not just forage maximally, and then also things like balancing trade-offs with predation risk. Okay, so this approach has been applied to humans a few times, and the interesting thing is when behavioral ecologists are, studying humans, it's well described in the Lalonde and Brown chapter, sort of the most famous behavioral ecologist of human behaviors is Monique Bergerauf-Mulder, but this isn't her example. This is someone else. Ooh, I was just reading that paper. That's right, by Blurton Jones. I just love that name. Hawks and O'Connell. They're trying to explain differences in actually like marriage and divorce rates and number of children and foraging decisions based on sort of on costs and benefits and ecological constraints. And it turns out that this was kind of a good approach in this example. So they were looking at the differences in whether children forage, and then also how that affects things like, um, parental care and divorce rates in two, um, uh, you know, pre-industrial societies that can be studied or have been studied within the last 100 years, the Kung and the Hadza. Um, and the Kung, who live in southern Africa, very arid and semi-arid environments, um, the children do almost no food gathering for themselves or for the group, the family, or larger groups as a whole. And there's a couple of reasons for that. When they like interviewed people and asked people about like why don't the kids come with you on your foraging rounds, the adults would say things like they just get in the way or they just get lost. So one thing is that it's actually harder to navigate in desert environments with fewer landmarks. So there is a danger of getting lost. The other thing is that the foods that are available for the Kung um, are nuts that um, are heavy when you collect a lot of them, and they need to be processed, right? Um, Shelled and ground. Um, and so the children can do some of that processing, but it makes much more sense for them to be doing that. They can't carry a large bag of nuts, which is what you can gather on a long foraging trip, and they also can't navigate well enough to do that on their own. Um, the Hadza children, in contrast, contribute substantially to their own caloric needs and even to group food. They forage in more productive savanna environment. Um, that's also a little bit easier to navigate. And they can collect 200 to 600 calories per food. And a lot of that includes fruits that don't require processing and can also be eaten as you're moving around and gathering, right? So you don't have to collect a huge load that's hard to carry back. So kids are perfectly um, suited to traveling with parents or even on their own, gathering, small fruits and eating. Um, so the profitability of foraging for children is higher. And then the interesting thing is, how do these differences in whether or not the children forage for food affect sort of things like family size uh, and survival and parental care? So between the Kung and the Hadza are less attentive parents. Um, the Hadza women spend more time foraging, and although they're foraging more for themselves, um, which allows them to have more children, right? So they have larger families. Um, the Kung have under five, 4.7 to 5 in different studies, children over their lifetime, and that's because of a longer interbirth interval because the Kung are um, they have to forage enough food to feed themselves and their children, so they can't actually feed themselves as well. Versus 6.2 for the Hadza. Um, the divorce rate is higher in Hadza, um, and that might well be related to the larger effect of divorce. In other words, both the full-time foraging of both men and women, of two parents, is needed to collect enough food to feed children in the Kung. In the Hadza, where the children are partly feeding themselves, a single parent can forage, enough food so that the children can, are not as severely affected. Although this leads to lower child survival in the Hadza. So the other thing is so women in the Hadza um, are foraging more, and men in the men in the Kung do more trapping of small game and foraging, collecting, gathering. Hadza men spend less time trapping small game, more time hunting for uncommon but highly rewarding large prey. The idea is that if you're a successful hunter of large prey, you'll be more able to share food with people outside of your family and basically divorce and marry someone else. Um, Interestingly, culturally, the Hadza were more resistant to assimilation into sort of, you know, colonial societies. Um, okay, so actually, I wanted to hammer down a couple points here because I thought the slide was here, but it might be later on. Um, Kung have lower lifetime fecundity, but higher child survival. So the Kung have fewer children, but the two parental care leads to higher survival of that smaller number of children, which is interesting. Okay, um, so that's basically an example where um, the sort of the strategies that it isn't nearly neatly as worked out as the bird foraging example. But what it is showing is that like the best explanation in this case of um, some of the behaviors like whether or not children forage and also sort of in this case like um, different investments in child rearing versus mate attraction in the parents, or having children versus caring for children in the parents, are sort of shaped by the rewards and constraints of different ecological, different environmental conditions. Um, Another interesting sort of example of like prey choice in humans is looking at prey choice in humans in the archaeological record. And basically what it shows is that when large, highly profitable prey is available, humans mostly, focus on those largest, most profitable prey items. However, local overpopulation and overexploitation leads to depletion of those resources, and then you start foraging for, hunting for, finding only the less profitable foods. So there are many examples in ecological record or in the archaeological record of um, population growth, um, then usually also coupled with um, dry spells or periods of climate change. Um, so I'm just actually going to say climate change. So there are great examples from the Mediterranean, like that the years 0 to 700, I think, um, were wetter than the centuries following that. And so you have, and you get that from um, like pollen deposits in the sediment in the Sea of Galilee. Wetter periods are characterized with like more oats um, and I forget what other grain, oats and wheat, and drier periods more rye and barley. And so you can really see wetter and drier periods, but you can also see um, effects of population density. So in um, Northern California, in the Holocene, you see during with lower populations and or more benign climate, you see more fishing for large sturgeon, large elk, and deer. And then as those resources become depleted, um, people are eating shellfish, acorns, and small mammals, the less profitable, smaller food items. In the Mediterranean, you can see periods where in the earlier periods with smaller populations, larger prey items are being eaten, tortoises, limpets, and also easier to find. Um, and then later you have sort of items that are also um, a little bit harder to catch. So smaller tortoises, limpets, but also smaller tortoises and limpets, and then more hares, rabbits. Rabbits take a lot more effort to actually, hunt down and trap, and so you only feed on them. So you can think of that as the search time is much greater for hares because you have to invest a lot of energy catching them. So you only do that when the larger and also slow-moving prey items are are used up. So we're going to see that here um, shifts in prey size going from 50,000 years ago to um, 30,000 years ago. So um, what you have here is in thousands of years. So this is more recent. Um, and then more distant past. And what you see is originally they're eating, um, I think these are the size of the bones in the tortoises. They're eating larger prey items. And then as those prey become less common, later on, they're eating smaller ones. So this is the mean humeral shaft diameter. So this is the diameter of one of the larger bones. And then you can also see here, um, in older times, there's, you know, more tortoise. And then later you have more of the fast, harder to catch, smaller hares and also more birds. I mean, the interesting thing about this, the thing that I would be interested here is also like when the thing I would ask about this study is like, I forget off the top of my head, it's killing me. Um, I'll, when were arrows invented? Um, right? I forget, but I think it's, I don't know if it's like within the last 10,000 years or like 20,000 years. So it's also possible that technology improved and made it easier to catch some of these faster moving animals as well. I've known when arrows are invented, and it's just I'm spacing on it. Ah, kills me. It's what happens when what you really study is pesticide resistance in bugs. Um, so this has been seen in human foraging over and over again. Um, when fish were plentiful in the ocean, we only caught the largest, cod, really large tuna, larger salmon, swordfish, um, and now we catch a lot of, herring, mackerel, sardines. We catch the fish that used to be just used as bait for catching the really large fish. But since we were somewhat optimal foragers, but we eliminated the largest fish, now we're stuck with eating the small stuff. Okay, so um, the the other thing that like the concept that kind of really drives or guides behavioral ecology thinking is the idea of trade-offs. So um, all the time, what we're always thinking of is because one of the central questions in evolutionary biology is like, why does genetic variation persist in populations when natural selection should be getting rid of all the less fit traits? Why do we see diversity in genes and diversity in phenotypes and diversity in behaviors? And the answer is, in general, usually is that different behaviors, traits, and genes even have um, trade-offs. The advantages they give in one context can be costly in another context, and then as selection varies, variation is maintained. Um, so um, the when we think about the Hadza and the Kung, um, the the Kung have a much longer nursing period, right? The kids can't go out and forage for themselves effectively when they're young, and the environment is less productive. So mothers have to invest more time in nursing, leading to a longer interbirth interval and smaller families. Um, and Blurt and Jones, um, humans are totally case-selected. We are. I mean, in general, humans are incredibly case-selected, right? We have long generation times. We have long dependent period. We have small broods. And so, yeah, in general, we are case selected. That being said, um, there's a lot of variation among humans in, family size and investment per child, right? So, in general, humans are case selected, compared to a dandelion um, or a tree, but um, but there's still variation and there are more R-selected and K-selected cultures. Um, so Blurt and Jones looked at sort of the survival of children born with shorter and longer intervals. So 4 years is typical in the Kungs. So they're nursing for at least 3 years and then becoming, fertile on a longer interval. Also because they're under some nutritional stress. And what was interesting was that like children born under a shorter um, interbirth interval had lower survival, higher mortality, lower survival. The thing though is that um, that might be hiding the true costs of having more children because it's possible that there's some self adjustment in that. In other words, it's possible that only the moms who are in the best um, physical condition, maybe are especially good foragers, are the ones that actually have children after just 2 or 3 years. So that could be hiding a larger cost. However, you can't do a manipulative experiment on a randomized control study on human reproduction. I mean, people have done horrific experiments, but like you shouldn't. Um, and so that means we're going to be doing correlational studies. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what a manipulative study is and sort of how you can do these kinds of trade-off studies in birds and non-human animals. So the classic example is this question that has dogged ornithologists for generations. Why do birds lay the number of eggs that they do? That was the question I was obsessed with when I was an undergrad. Um, and so the most general, or one of the early hypotheses, was by a prominent ornithologist, David Lack, who hypothesized that the ability of parents to feed the young in the nest was constraining how large the broods could be, right? So he was saying that birds should lay the maximum number of eggs that they can feed and rear to fledging, to leaving the nest. And so there's a prediction, which is if birds are doing that, then if we go out into nature, then the clutch sizes, and I don't know if, what is a clutch? Um, a clutch, birds lay eggs in clutches, which is a single group of eggs. So in chickens, for example, chickens are terrible, they're wonderful birds, but they're a terrible example because they've been bred to basically not really lay in clutches. But even chickens decide after a while that they've completed a clutch. And if you didn't collect the eggs, the chickens would lay about 15, 20 eggs, and then they'd stop and they would incubate them. But different species have different ranges of what their clutch size is going to be. And some are really strict, like shorebirds generally lay only 4 eggs. So I'm going to, for example, shorebirds usually lay 4 eggs, and they don't start to incubate until they've laid that 4th egg, and then they start warming the eggs so that they'll all develop at about the same time. But no bird lays more than like 1 egg in a day. So they'll lay eggs, over a period of like 5 or 6 days, they'll lay 4 eggs, and then they'll start sitting on them to warm them up. House sparrows lay clutches of 4 to 6 eggs in New York, usually 2 to 3 in Costa Rica, where I was studying them. Okay, so that's sort of a range of clutch sizes. Ducks that produce young that can feed themselves, much like the Hadza, they have much larger clutches. They lay 15 or 6, 20 eggs. Okay, so that's a clutch. And so when a whole bunch of ornithologists went out to study egg laying in birds, they mostly studied it, like they still do, in birds that lay eggs in nest boxes, because those are the easiest species to study. But they've done it in regular open nesting birds as well. And what they find is, actually, birds usually are conservative. What does conservative mean? So in this case, this is a blue tit, another chickadee relative in the Paridae. And the most common clutch size is 8.7 eggs. But the clutch size that seems to have the highest fitness, and in this case, fitness is defined as the number of chicks surviving to the next year. So these are wonderful long-term studies. They band all the chicks in the nest, and so they end up with a population of almost all banded birds, and then they see who comes back the next year and is alive and able to breed successfully. So this is chicks surviving to next year. What they find is the birds laying larger clutches actually have more chicks coming back. So the big question is, like, why don't birds lay eggs of 11, 12, and 13 most commonly? And there's a bunch of answers to that question. One, maybe we're not measuring the right fitness consequences. So maybe the trade-offs are not how many survive fledging or even how many survive to the next year, but how many survive to the next year and successfully breed, and how many chicks do they have. So we're going to look at different fitness measures. But the other thing is that maybe, quite likely, the trade-offs that are there are being masked by variation in individual quality. So let's say instead of birds' eggs, we wanted to figure out, like, what are the costs and benefits of different car buying strategies in humans. And so what we did, we made this prediction that people who buy more expensive cars will have less money in the bank because they've spent money on these fancy cars. People who buy cheaper cars will save a lot of money, and so they should have more money in the bank. And then you go and do that study, and so it should be that you know what the prediction is that auto buying is a costly trait, and so the Ferrari, if we look at the bank account and we ask, um, what's the bank accounts of people with Ferraris versus Hyundai owners? And then what we predict is Hyundais are cheaper, so they should have a higher bank account than they should have larger bank accounts than people spending lots of money on cars. And so that's the prediction. But as you know, if you're going to do this study, the what you find is the opposite. People with Ferraris have larger bank accounts. This is the um, you know observed. And why is that result? Why do we have that result? Because we're not controlling for the money in the bank before the purchase is made, right? So only the wealthy can afford to buy the expensive car, and they have more money in the bank after buying that car than the non-wealthy. I am driving an 11-year-old Mazda 5, and there you go. You can make whatever conclusions you want out of that. But I'm very happy because it's very easy to park, and it's also already dented. So when people bump into me, like at street lights, or I just walk up to the car after it's parked last night and it's got a new dent, no biggie. There you go. So what you have to do is either you have to do a sophisticated statistical study, like where you look at the bank accounts before and after they buy the cars, or you're controlling for individual condition, or you have to do a manipulation. You have to like force wealthy and poor people to buy expensive or inexpensive cars, um, and then you'll see what happens to their bank accounts. And that's kind of a goofy and impossible study, but like I said, with birds, you can do it. So if you do a randomized control trial, and you randomly pick some birds to get extra eggs and some birds to take away eggs, and to control for the disturbance, you take away everyone's eggs, then you move them around, and then you randomly give some back their eggs plus a couple more, and some you never give anything back. But you want to make the experiment as the same as possible. And so when you do that, and you look at more fitness measures. So this is a classic study by Schluter and Gustafsson. They manipulated collared flycatcher clutch sizes, and then they looked at a bunch of things, but they looked at the fecundity. Fecundity, remember, is, I use that word a lot, fecundity, number of offspring. They looked at the fecundity of the daughters that grew up in those enlarged, unchanged, or reduced broods, and what they found is when you grow up in a smaller clutch than your mom actually laid, um, you end up being in better condition and laying more eggs yourself. However, when you grow up in a clutch that's larger than what your mom originally laid, you end up laying fewer eggs, um, probably because you're in worse condition because you were competing for attention with more siblings and your parents were constrained in their ability to feed you. So when you do a manipulative study, you can really see these trade-offs and these costs and benefits of different studies. And so like now this has been replicated with a number of other species. Again, kestrels are interesting, partly because they're badass, cool falcons that eat other birds, but also they breed in nest boxes, so we can put out 1,000 nest boxes and attract kestrels and then study them. So it's been studied in kestrels as well. In this case, it's not as it's it's not like the offspring's fecundity. It's just they're surviving to adulthood, and in uh, this is in enlarged broods, the um, the survival proportion surviving is lower. In reduced broods, survival is higher. Cool. So people have studied the behavioral ecology of um, animal mating systems to exhaustion and tremendous sort of richness and detail, and they've tried to look at that in humans, and actually it's not super successful. Like the earlier study looking at like divorce rates and how it relates to um, and how it relates to how it depends on children's ability to feed themselves, which relates to the overall productivity of the environment, is kind of a fairly successful example. Um, but the studies that attempt to take like models directly from animals and apply them to humans have been, usually are disproven. So that's what this example is going to be. Okay, so mating systems, the patterns of pairing, um, the basic ones that you want to, know about are monogamy, where you have a single male and female working together to, um, produce offspring and sometimes rear them. Um, that's seen in some insects, um, some mammals, a high proportion of birds, and some fish. Polyandry is when you have a single female mating with many males. So that's seen in like in honeybees and in some birds and some mammals. Polygyny or polygyny is when you have one male, a single male mating with multiple females. And it's seen in a lot of, it's seen in some insects and some birds and a lot of mammals. There's also, obviously polygynandry, which would be called like promiscuity. Definitely see that in lots of insects. Um, and Polygyny, Dawkins talks about it. It's thought to result from the initial asymmetry in investment in eggs and sperm. In other words, eggs are expensive, harder to produce, and so more limiting. So the idea is that females are limited by the amount of infertility, by the amount of eggs that they can produce. Um, Males might be less limited by the amount of sperm that they can produce. They could fertilize a large number of eggs, and so would lead to um, that would lead to polygyny. And it's sort of interesting to see when you have different mating systems in different organisms. So because of that initial anisogamy difference in gamete size, um, it's interesting when we do see cases of male monogamy. So I said honeybees are a case of polyandry, which is true, but that's for the females. Female mates with multiple males, but each male honeybee um, dies in the course of um, mating. Yeah, so a lot of these social insects where a female goes on a single mating flight with several males. But the thing is that like I'm not sure about ants because I don't know whether the males mate only once or multiple times in ants off the top of my head, which is a glaring omission and sort of horrifies me, but I'm going to go look that up after lecture. Um, but in honeybees, the males, yeah, like their whole guts come out when they mate, and so they die in the process of successful mating, so they only mate once. Um, and then there's the the other really interesting example of redback spiders, where the males, at least when they're mating with adult um, females, will, many of them, not all of them, will flip over and present themselves to be eaten. When they do that, the female eats, so she lays more eggs, so he enhances his fitness in that way. But the important benefit is she mates with him longer while she's eating, and that allows the male to, um, release more sperm, break off one of his pedipalps as a possible plug, and increase paternity, um, and prevent the female sometimes from mating another time. So these are cases where the benefits of basically giving everything you have for the male favors monogamy, although in both these cases, sort of death. So, Faraz, that's a good question, um, and the answer is sometimes the results get shaped by how they're studied and like what kind of enclosure they're studied in. So yeah, there are plenty of cases of sexual cannibalism where the male is not presenting himself to be eaten. Although the redback spider is an interesting example where the male does present himself to be eaten. Um, I had a colleague in grad school who studied sexual cannibalism in mantids, and he measured the costs and benefits for the males, and it did not, the costs, the benefits did not outweigh the cost of being eaten for males. So like mantids, when they eat the male, um, they lay a few more eggs, um, but the male misses out on opportunities to mate with other females, and late in the summer, like the sex ratio, because the females are eating the males, gets highly female biased. So a living male has terrifically high opportunities to like mate again, and it would really be in their best advantage to not get eaten. In contrast, the redback spiders live in deserts, sparse, hard to find females. So the benefit of successfully mating with the female that you're with is much greater. And then like the paternity advantages I described are real as well. But the thing that should shape your intuition here is just the behavior. So redback males flip over and present themselves to be eaten. Mantid males never do that. They try like crazy to escape, and they get eaten more often in like captivity when they're in jars than out in the field. They do get eaten in the field, but less often because they have more opportunity to escape. And you should use like the behavior of the organisms to like shape your intuition and predictions. I was like really surprised that that wasn't like an obvious intuition, and that my colleague was surprised by the result when the behavior was sort of telling you what the result should be. And they were in grad school at the same time. Mariana Andrade is the researcher who I forget if she's now at Cornell or University of Toronto, who had a spectacularly successful master's thesis studying the redback spiders. And I mean, she's a behavioral ecologist and arachnologist and studies a whole bunch of species, but she was one that worked out that the benefits exceeded the costs for males to be eaten in redback spiders, but like, and got a science paper out of it. And the other guy, spent 3 years and then was like surprised that the benefits didn't exceed the cost for mantid males, but mantid males try to escape. That should like tell you something. Um, okay, but monogamy is not only favored by total sacrifice of your life, sort of desperate, um, worth anything to gain to get an opportunity to fertilize. Monogamy is also favored when paternal care, um, really benefits the offspring and also can match female fecundity. So seahorses are a great system for looking at, studying mating systems because there's a variety in different species. But the mating system in some seahorses is that the females lay eggs into a male pouch. The male's pouch is, as big as the female's ovaries, and so males can care for, um, you know, all the eggs that a female can lay, at least in a clutch, and then the males will carry them and maintain their, temperature and oxygenation at good rates until they hatch. Um, in fact, paternal care in some species can be so valuable that females will mate guard and try to prevent other females from mating with the male, because when the male mates with multiple females, his like paternal care is divided. So these are species where both the males and the females work to gather, um, process, um, uh, carcasses like dead mice, dead birds that they find. They have to bury them, and then um, they have to guard them, and they have to uh, sometimes they have to like process the food, like chew it and regurgitate it to like feed the young. Um, and what's cool is that, when females were tethered, um, and couldn't interfere with the male's behavior, um, the males would release pheromones that are designed to attract females to a carcass that they have and lay their eggs there. And if they do that, then the first female's eggs are going to have competition from another brood, and her young are not going to have as much food to grow on. When you allow the females to interact with the males, they basically prevent the males from advertising the carcass that the female had already laid eggs in, and sort of the females do mate guarding in order to enforce monogamy, which increases the value of paternal care. Um, and in some species, um, the advantages of maternal paternal care um, will lead to infanticide. So you may remember reading about or hearing about um, infanticide in like lion prides and in primates where um, males have only a short period usually of reproductive access, of sort of control over a group. And when a new male takes control of a pride, they will often kill the cubs that are alive at that time, and that leads to females becoming receptive to mate, within the time frame of like 2 or 3 years that males can usually sort of maintain control over a pride. This is in lions. Um, we see the same in reverse in some shorebirds. So this is a Hasana. It's a tropical sort of sandpiper relative, lives in sort of freshwater marshes, and females will um, control territories within which 1, 2, or 3, or 4 males will build nests, and the female will take turns laying eggs in each of those nests. And then the males will do the parental care for those chicks. And there was a study where um, uh, I think it was Steve Emlin um, manipulated. Actually, um, he trapped and shot females that were territory holders with nests with eggs in them, so that those territories would then get taken over by a new female. And when he did that, the new female killed the eggs that were already in the nest so that she could lay her eggs in the nests. Um, this study actually led to a revision of like conditions for publication in literature. It led to kind of an uproar, and now societies like ornithological, um, the AOU, American Ornithologists Union, Journal of Mammalogy, have a set of ethical guidelines for studies that they will permit to be published. So there are certain practices that are no longer permitted, like toe clipping for marking individual mammals and stuff like that. So progress gets made slowly. Okay. Um, Monogamy is found in species that, a subset of species, some species that require paternal care as well as maternal care. So these are both figures showing examples where single parent or single parent nests or burrows have much lower um, survival of offspring. So this is in California field mice. Um, the you have fewer, I mean, of course you have fewer pups emerging from burrows than were born, which makes sense. But if you have only a single parent, then a smaller fraction of the pups that were born actually emerge from the nest. And similarly, nests with, in starlings, nests with two parents, the eggs are incubated for a longer period, and then nests with only a female. Um, interest, Interestingly, so social monogamy is the most common mating system in birds. Um, when I say social monogamy, I mean two birds paired for at least a season, usually multiple seasons, um, and both are sharing in feeding chicks in the nest. That's not the same thing as genetic monogamy. So social monogamy is common, but genetic monogamy is rare. This is really cool. It started off, there was a researcher who, for another reason, was sterilized males, I think starlings, in a study in the 70s, and was surprised that a lot of the eggs were hatching in the nests anyway. And then as DNA fingerprinting and then other um, uh, you know, paternity and maternity assessing techniques became common, now we have hundreds of studies where paternity has been assessed. And in most bird species, some fraction of offspring. Loons and scrub jays are the exception. There hasn't been an extra pair copulation or extra pair fertilization um, that's been observed. The what What's emerged is that there's often a trade-off for birds between paternal care, how much effort a male spends feeding the chicks in the nest, versus pursuing extra pair copulation. So males that spend more time singing, which can attract a second mate, spend less time feeding the young, and the young per brood is less when, in this case, um, you know, testosterone is added, and the male is made to, hormonally, to spend more time singing and trying to advertise. So one of the sort of classic early studies of mating systems is in the Dunnocks. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take a break. We're going to take like a 7-minute break. At 8:05, the heritability quiz is going to come online. I'm going to stop here, and we'll take a quiz. It'll be a quick quiz.